Welcome back to part 3 of this course. As a little refresher, in part 2 we learned about frequencies and bet sizes. Dividing the options into 4 buckets, we explored the following insights. 1. Small range bets are preferred when your opponent's range includes a lot of trash and you have an overall equity advantage. 2. Big bets at medium to low frequency are preferred when your opponent's range has a lot of hands that can improve on further streets due to a dynamic board. The more their range has nut and good hands which your range doesn't, the less frequent you want to bet with your range. 3. Small bets at low frequency happen when your opponent has a nut advantage and many hands that can improve. Your range may have an overall advantage in good hands, but because of their large amount of nut hands, you simply have to cut back on frequency and size of your bets. 4. Big bets at high frequency happen when your range is absolutely destroying your opponent's. You have an advantage in nut hands and your opponent's trash hands could improve to nut hands, but so rarely that they can't continue against a large bet. Also, this usually happens more often when the SPR is rather low. Now, since this is all the approach based on the GTO solution, this is valuable information to base your game on. Knowing the fundamental approach helps you play against tough opponents which are playing close to optimal themselves. However, this is not always the case. In contrary, as a player who wants to play profitably, you should make sure that this is the case as rarely as possible. Instead, you want to play against players that don't play close to GTO, but make mistakes and give you the chance to profit. For this scenario, it is useful to know the optimal approach, because you can recognize how your opponents deviate from it and adjust accordingly. But how do we want to adjust to deviations and deviate from GTO ourselves when we know or expect our competition to play suboptimal? In this part, we will cover exactly that. Before covering some exact player profiles which we'll examine, we'll start off by exploring the effect of differences in ranges. In the last part, we only looked at GTO ranges to discover the impact on C-bets, which makes sense, because we wanted to know about the base approach. But now, we want to see how the approach changes when the inputs change. So instead of using GTO Wizard, where we cannot change the inputs, we'll use Pure Solver for this exercise. Let's jump right into some example spots and see how the solver strategy changes. We'll start off with one of the spots where a small range bet was preferred, namely the Queen-Queen 5 rainbow flop from the cutoff open versus big blind call. Here, we're looking at the exact same parameters as before when we were looking at GTO Wizard. The same flop, the same pre-flop ranges, and the same flop sizings. Again, we see that the small range bet is optimal. Nothing new. Now, we'll keep the cutoff's range the same as before and change the big blind's range. Let's start by making it wider, giving the big blind even more low-suited and also off-suited hands to flat pre-flop. How do you expect our strategy as the cutoff to change? A. Increased or decreased frequency of bets. And B. Increased or decreased sizing of the bet. Well, for A, it's pretty obvious that the frequency cannot increase because it's already at 100%. And since a wider range from the big blind would have led to a more frequent c-bet in general, nothing really changes. For B, it's basically the same. It was already the smallest sizing that was bet at 100%, so making the big blind's range wider cannot make the sizing be used even more often, which would have been the trend you could expect. So now we'll go the other way around. Instead of widening the big blind's range, we'll make it tighter, removing some of these bottom-suited hands and the worst of their off-suited holdings. And just as we would expect, the frequency of betting shifts. As the amount of trash hands in the big blind's range goes down, the frequency of the cutoff c-bets goes down as well. We have basically only removed hands from the big blind's range that would have folded on this board. So with a much smaller amount of folds from the big blind, the cutoff cannot simply c-bet any two. However, the preferred sizing stays the same. Even though they have an overall range disadvantage, the big blind is not kept regarding nut holdings. A bunch of Queen X and Pocket 5s are still in their range, which makes the cutoff stick to a smaller bet size. If the cutoff would bet bigger, they wouldn't make use of their range advantage, because the bigger the bet, the less you need to